Everyone. Welcome to today's topic. We are talking about ethical and inclusive AI. I would like to introduce our speakers and maybe they can also introduce themselves. We have got Victoria Vojnovic, who is working on her PhD, um, and she is which with HCL Tech in the States. Am I right?
Correct.
Uh,
Correct.
could you tell us a couple more words about yourself?
Sure. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and as Alina said, I am completing my PhD within weeks now, within weeks, um, on the future of work, and specifically for mid to late career women, executives, and my interests in AI. So I lead AI-led transformations. Um, in the public sector and private equity sectors for HCL Tech. And my specific interest here is really around equity when it comes to AI, and AI is kind of the great equalizer that and its potential to be that. So that's really what my focus is as far as um, some research results from my that I'm writing in my dissertation and what I want to talk about tonight.
Amazing. Welcome. We also have got Stacy and Barry, who has got a course actually on Udacity on the topic of AI governance. And Stacy is the founder of B Stellar Group. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
That's
Could
correct.
you tell us a bit more about what you do?
Certainly. And thank you for hosting us, Selena. Great to connect with everyone. And thank you for joining us on this evening. So I am the founder and president of B Stella Group, but my background is, of course, public policy. So I'm very interested with the intersection of tech and policy, but the impact of technology systems on society, which includes environment and our human rights. And so I've spent the last 4 years just trying to learn the lay of the land when it comes to different policy legislation across the globe. What is happening in Canada? How does that compare to the US? And it's more of an exploratory journey for myself to understand these impacts and the direction of governments, because as someone who is in the world of public policy, I'm very interested in shaping public policy for the betterment of society.
So amazing. It's great to have you both here. And today's topic is um, ethical and inclusive AI. We are now in 2026, and often companies view this as one of those nice to have things. And let's be honest, if you're not in a regulated industry, governance and ethics might be an afterthought, or it might not even factor in. I've heard somebody say that we have more regulation around our sandwiches, unfortunately, and our coffee cups than we have around AI technology. And it's way more dangerous, to be honest, because we can do so much with it, and it the regulation and the ethics is a bit vague around this topic. So in 2026, I'm going to open up with the question for you. Is AI still a nice to have? Or has it become that leadership competency that determines who wins or who falls behind? What are your thoughts? Victoria?
Okay, I'll start. So, first of all, I don't think AI is a nice to have for anybody. For those of you who are not aware, the World Economic Forum's annual gathering starts next week in Davos, Switzerland, and AI is going to be on the menu everywhere, in every conversation with every company and in all domains. And just recently, back in November, they published the the skills demands for 2030. They usually publish 5 years out, where they project skills. And the number one skill is AI. AI is going to become table stakes for no matter what field you're in, no matter what role you're in, no matter what company you're in, no matter what you do, you have to know AI. So the question is it a fad? No, it's not a fad. Are we scaled yet? No. we're way far from scaled. And I think that's what 2026 becomes the pivotal year around is how do we get from pilots here, pilots there, trying things out, learning to actually scaling, which dives right into this conversation around responsible AI and governance and equity in AI. All of those things will really come to light as we scale because you can play around with pilots and maybe skirt the issue a little bit, but if you're going to scale it in your organization, if you're going to scale it in your nation, if you're going to scale it in your nonprofits and everywhere, which is what, World Economic Forum projects, clearly we have to be leaning much more towards a governance system and policy and equity in order to make that happen. That's my thought. But over to you, Stacey. I'd love to know what you think about this one.
Yeah, certainly. And those are some good thoughts. And when we think of these international bodies like UNESCO, United Nations, and these World Economic Forums, they're trying to get the world to be on the same page. And that is actually what the challenge is, right? You may have some countries that want to scale at all cost, and they may not want to anchor their AI governance in a human-centered approach. So it's like, how do we find that middle ground where, yes, we don't want to get to a place where we feel like those who are developing these AI tools are constantly saying that, regulation is stifling innovation. And it's like, it's not, because we do have regulation in other sectors that are very scalable, very successful. We think of banking and finance, and we think of pharmaceuticals. And so it's trying to get these countries to kind of be on the same page so that they can have a national AI strategy that is anchored in some kind of shared community value. And that is shaped by a lot of different things with how every country is. Like some countries are very capitalistic, some have different underpinnings as to how they build their countries and how their laws are set. And so trying to get us on the same page is a challenge, but I think that Canada has a great opportunity to be a leader in this space, as opposed to waiting for us to, get on the same page. We really should commit to AI governance principle that is with that human-centered approach and best practices and the accountability, because there are those frameworks already set by the United Nations that somewhat aligns with our Canadian values as it is. So I think there's an opportunity for countries to decide what their national AI strategy should be, but they have to be very mindful of amplifying the voices of those who typically don't get a chance to shape these discussions and shape these task force that governments have issued. And so to make sure that no one is left out and it's inclusive as well as an equitable and ethical approach, they really have to have a grassroots, bottom up approach to making sure that we have some consistency and some streamlining for how we scale AI.
I love that. And Alina, if it's okay, I'd just like to pivot on one comment that you really leaned onto, which is human-centric AI, which is an area where I have a personal passion around, because it really dives into some of the other spaces. One, we think a lot of people think of AI as a technology revolution, which it is. But we've been through a lot of technology revolutions in my lifetime and in yours. We've come a long way technology wise. This is the first time where humanity and the human piece of the puzzle becomes critical to the success. So when we hear about fears, AI is going to take my job, when we hear about the machine is going to make all the decisions, and when we talk about things like policy and we talk about things like governance, and we don't consider that human-centered AI leadership lens, that's where we get into trouble. Because the reality is that in that list that I talked about from the World Economic Forum, the top two skills were digital skills, right? AI skills and data science skills. Those were one and two. Everybody's going to have that. The next six were all human skills: curiosity, lifelong learning, strategic thinking, innovation, all those spaces that are the human pieces of the connection. And so when the World Economic Forum put this list together, I really believe they did it from a human-centered AI leadership lens. And I once heard a comedian say, about a year ago, say, AI is not going to take my job because AI can't be funny. And it reminded me of an old episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation where the android was trying to be a comedian. And he went and learned every comic bit of every comedian in the history of time. And yet he wasn't funny because you can know all the lines, you can say all the words, you can do all the things. That's not what makes you funny. It's your humanity that makes you funny. In the same way, we can have agents that can do all the tasks, but they can't think about what's around the corner because they haven't been programmed to think about what's around the corner because that's a human trait. And so I appreciate you bringing the human-centric IT to this conversation.
And another, I'm hearing the concern is, well, actually, 70% of organizations these days are using AI, but only maybe 30% or fewer are actually reporting having mature AI governance in place. And nobody is speaking about the ethics. Nobody is talking about those dangers. We are seeing some case studies coming out, such as Deloitte that got in some trouble by publishing that article and getting in trouble, that Australia case. And there are a few others where Air Canada gave some bad advice because they had a chatbot that I guess didn't have all the context and provided misleading, incorrect information. So unfortunately, they get into some trouble. But this regulatory exposure, it's accelerating. And we
Absolutely.
need the AI-related regulation, potentially maybe even some fines around it. We don't know yet. But unfortunately, across industries, across governments, we don't have that regulation yet. And this is very powerful technology. And my question to you is, what do you believe is the most dangerous part of this? The executives believe that, yes, we should have ethical AI, but how is it actually shaping up and how is it showing up in companies across industries?
Mhm. I probably want to lean into that a bit because that's what inspired me to get into this intersection of tech and policy. And it's around the impact piece because we're now in a world where AI is being used to determine who gets fired, hired, access to care, those who are on the job hunt. We're hearing the stories of the AI, going through those resumes, but there's no real human looking at it, and some very qualified people are getting missed. There's also cases, but mainly in the US, of these biased algorithms in healthcare that will determine that one group is more fitting for care than another when the other group is actually found to be um, more sick, for example. And so there's some inequities in who gets access to care and when, right? So when we think of like the consequences on people's lives when we think of their health, their financial information, how that's being used perhaps unfortunately against them, where it's now being used to amplify inequalities because there's no guardrails, because there's no checks and balances. So it's who gets access to loans and who doesn't, because there's historical bias data that these AI systems are using to make these decisions when it comes to finance, when it comes to our judicial system. And that's really what motivated me to get involved because unfortunately, it's usually the marginalized communities, women, people with other, disabilities that are at most risk of the harms. But those who are building usually or who are controlling public discourse aren't typically the ones who are at risk. So they may not prioritize ethics because it may not directly impact them, but I think we're all indirectly impacted in some way. So those are some of the critical things that makes it essential and pretty much an emergency to regulate this thing before it scales because some of these harms can't really be undone when you're really harming people's lives.
You're absolutely right, Stacey Ann. And I think the big piece is you have to have the right people at the table, right? There have to be the people who can ask the questions. In some cases, and I read an article just a short while ago about a big mistake that Claude made recommending salaries. and they took two resumes of exactly the same qualified person. One person had a masculine sounding name, one person had a feminine sounding name, and they recommended different starting salaries, different benefits packages, because those inequities have happened over time, and the LLM was trained based on history, not based on what should be or what is equalizing. The reality is the people that are, even when we have human in the loop and humans are going back and validating the information, we don't have the right seats at the table to ask the right questions. So my concern is, yes, we can put policy in place that says all LLMs have to go through some level of scrutiny or whatever, or we can have policy around other forms of governance, and you must have the right people at the table who are looking from the right lens. I have a daughter who's deaf. I can tell you that I don't even have to check how many AI agents don't consider a deaf person. I am sure of it because I know what her experience is in life and not being considered. So if she's not considered outside of the AI world, can almost guarantee that she's not being considered in the AI world. And the key is, who are we bringing to the table? So I believe it is kind of a three-legged stool, right? It's making sure that the technology has access to equitable thinking in order to be trained. It is governance to say, how are we going to insert ourselves in the human in the loop systems where humans must be the final arbiter, not the agents. And then the third is making sure that the right people are arbitrating that. And I think you have to have all three in order to have that kind of success.
Mhm. And just to add to what you were saying, Victoria, that also has to be in the life cycle of the AI system, right? So the design, the deployment, and the operation of it, and making sure you have those equity lens throughout the life cycle. You don't just do a one-time audit, set it and forget it. It has to be continuous to make sure the data is accurate, it's up to date, it's clean data, so that we can address some of these issues in the data.
Which I think goes back to Wef saying continuous learning,
Yes.
lifelong learning is a key skill. You've got to have people who are curious enough to always say, I don't know what I don't know, and
Mhm.
I need to go look, and I need to continue to learn, and I need to continue to adapt. And if we don't have humans doing that, then think about the adaptation cycle for a particular AI. It's not there's It's like when your kids are little and you take them bowling and you put up the gutter guard so you're absolutely convinced they're going to hit a pin no matter where the ball goes out of their hands. You've got to have guardrails. You've got to have those gutter guards to make sure that you don't get too off scope, because then it's too hard to pull back.
Yeah. Mhm.
We actually have a question from the audience. I think, Stacy, you speak about this in your course on Udacity. The question
Mhm.
is, how will governance and legislation protect humanity with the rapidly accelerating trajectory of advancement of AI, and what we need to accomplish to get there? And I know you speak about this, and I know you explore this topic quite a bit. Uh,
Okay, and thank you for your question, Kevin. I see it in the chat. This kind of takes us into a different aspect, and I won't go too deep into it because it's going a little bit in another direction, but it does have to do with the environmental impacts. And so I personally think there should be, the way there is building codes, there should be these requirements for these data centers to make sure that when it comes to the public grids that we have that they need to use to increase their compute power, there's some regulations around who is going to bear the cost. There's a lot of cases in the US where unfortunately the cost is on the residents and they're protesting for higher electricity bills and the data centers are not paying their fair share. And it's not the same as the traditional data centers for internet. There is way more electricity and even water that these data centers are using to cool because they can overheat. And so the more we use it, the more we're all contributing to it. But it's not to say that governments can't be proactive and create some guidelines and making sure that that guidelines includes consultation for the public, right? I wouldn't want a data center in my backyard, but we should be informed before it comes there so that it's zoned in certain areas that may not cause, um, you know, harms to residents in certain communities. And that's going to be a big challenge because you're going to have big corporations that have the means, the money, the resources to lobby for where they think they should be placed and how they think these costs should be. So I just think the more people that are engaged with their elected officials, the three levels of government, just expressing their concerns, the type of legislation they would like to see, we all can contribute to shaping public policy because then politicians aren't just hearing the corporate perspective on this. They could hear from everyday citizens. They need to hear from more small business owners. So, as someone who's been in the world of lobbying, I do see that huge gap where there just isn't enough of us shaping public policy in that nonpartisan way by speaking at committee hearings, just having that one-on-one meeting with your elected official to let them know the solutions you have. I think everybody has valid ideas and solutions that need to be channeled up at the decision table. And unfortunately, it just isn't enough. And so I hope that, answers your question.
Thank you. I want to bring back this discussion towards organizations and what is taking place right now in enterprises in particular. We have got many concerns from biased systems. If our data is biased, it gets propagated. We have got potential ungoverned Gen AI use. We can also train machine learning models. We can actually train to predict, like that case was Amazon, that they trained an AI system to select best candidates, but they only fed resumes from male employees. And the system was unfairly only selecting those that were men for the job. This is, I'm sure some of you have heard about this one, but where do you feel is that where do leaders need to focus? We have got many of these concerns, and leadership teams, they don't always have got the understanding of the art of the possible. And often it's that speed for innovation. You need to be on top of everything, and you need to understand what is that you're deploying. But then all of this ethics and governance, it's kind of an afterthought.
Well, so I think there's a couple of things. One, yes, the case study with Amazon was pretty published. It was pretty well propagated, so a lot of people heard about it. So I think we have to look at two things. Where were we like maybe a year ago? Where are we headed? Because I think that there is an awareness, at least that I know in my company, there's an awareness, and I know in, the peer companies to my company, there is much more an awareness. Plus, the EU has created some much stronger governance. They're kind of leading in the governance space for AI. And it's interesting that you talk about the art of the possible. I think it continues to feed back to human-centered leadership, right? Really having a good grasp of what pieces of work should be done by an agent, can be, because if you think about what can be, it's too easy to say everything can be, right? Like we could just code something to can be. And you always say, well, okay, maybe it can be, but should it be? Right? If we have that human-centered leadership perspective, and another space that leads into is what is your new corporate operating model when employees have peers that may be an agent? You could have humans and agents working on the same team. What is the work that the humans are doing? What is the work that the agents are doing? How are employees being measured? A lot of output, a lot of employee output is based on the KPIs that they're given. What are you measured to do? That's the work you're going to do. So as we scale AI, as we continue to build and scale, it is really important in this year to make sure that your operating model, how do different functions work together? Because as Stacy said, clean data is the key, right? If you don't have clean data, if you don't have good data, garbage in, garbage out. And in the corporate model, in the enterprise model, AI is going to cross boundaries. And so when I talk about it being the great equalizer, that's one of the spaces. right? Probably for the first time in corporate history in a lot of companies, the back office functions, right? The corporate functions, procurement, finance, legal, those lines are going to blur because the data sources are going to be used by all of them. So these previous back office functional silos, which are actually the stuff that powers the front office, powers sales, powers marketing, um, they have a different lens. And so again, it is how does everybody work together? What is the operating model and the governance and the data to make sure if you don't have that set, then you are scaling the bad, right? It goes back to I just because I can do it doesn't mean I should. But leaders have to have that human-centered approach. If they don't, if they cannot be clear, where do humans play? Where do agents play? And HR teams have to rewrite roles, rewrite KPIs, making sure that employees understand what they're being measured to do. It's a very, very different world. There's a lot of standardization that happens before anything gets scaled.
Mhm. I just want to add to what you're saying, Victoria. This is really essential and it's a challenge, right? But
Mhm.
it's also important to ensure that, corporate leaders and executive are clear on the capabilities of AI and its limitations, what it can, what it can't do, having approaches that's unique to different departments, because there might be certain AI systems that's ideal for marketing that shouldn't just be in every department like HR, right? So I think having the principle, which is a governance principle of transparency, and communication around how a decision was made, whether it's measuring those KPIs for performances and things like that, or sales will just help the users or the employees of the AI to just better understand it because there's that hesitancy because we know the trust is low. People are very fearful that I'm training something that's going to replace me. I'm giving all my how-tos with my job to this system that's going to replace me, but it's actually going to enhance and augment you. And I think when executive leaders and leaders of departments reiterate and reinforce that and have it as a part of the change management conversation, it will help people to adapt in a smoother way, might be less friction because you can integrate it. But then if people aren't using it and there's like a low adoption, well, that's not good for the bottom line and the money that was spent to kind of use these tools. So those are some other approaches in terms of making sure that you're embedding in your like change management process these AI governance principle of communication, of accountability, having human oversight, making sure that there is some clear accountability as who's going to take responsibility for when something does go wrong and constantly, updating the staff, giving people an opportunity to maybe pilot some of these things. The upskilling and the training that's required is something that I think corporations should invest in as opposed to leaving the onus on the individual workers to do that heavy lifting. And so yeah, there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's very possible. So seeing how it
Well,
unfolds.
yeah, Stacey, and you brought up some really, really good points because, first of all, I think change management got left out of the AI equation from day one, and AI is a change management program. AI adoption is a change management program on steroids, right?
Mhm.
It is truly, truly a change management program because it affects all functions, because it affects all employees, because it affects governments, because it affects nonprofits, because it affects all areas of society. If you have one thing that becomes a core foundational skill, no matter where you sit on the planet, change management has to be innate in
Yeah.
anything that's happening, and it has been left out of the equation for
Mhm.
sure. For
Mhm.
upskilling, I agree with you completely. The things that I want uh, corporate training or whoever's doing training to not forget about is again, if you go back to that list of the top 10, the first two are technical, the next six our human skills. We still
Mhm.
need to know how to build strategic plans. We still
Yeah.
need to encourage innovation and design thinking and curiosity in those
Mhm.
spaces.
Mhm.
So I see a lot of AI training programs, which is make sure you understand all the fundamentals of AI. Absolutely, everybody needs to do that. I'm not saying that you don't. I'm saying there's an and to it about bringing those other skills to the forefront.
Mhm.
Actually, this is kind of why we founded AI Future Leaders, because we understand that upskilling is going to be very key. And we have been observing, for example, the Industrial Revolution. It took 100 years, a decade of change to adapt. You had the horse and then you had the machine. Now we have got the same thing happening, but instead of 100 years, it's got compressed. Instead of a century, it got compressed into maybe a decade. We're going to
Mhm.
see these things shift in just maybe 5, 10 years. And
Yeah.
humans are not that quick to adapt. And we also have got the question regarding marginalized communities. Are they included in the process? And I want to add to this, what about women? AI is going after jobs that are maybe knowledge-based and quite
Mhm.
a bit administrative tasks.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, those are um, roles that typically often occupied by women. So
Mhm.
women are twice as likely to be impacted in general in population by AI transformation as men. So what are some of your thoughts? And I know, Victoria, you are conducting a PhD on this, and Stacy, you're also researching the impact of AI technology on women, and how is it that we include and protect some of these individuals?
Yeah. Stacy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, certainly I can go first. So one of the interesting reports that I was going through was Lean In and the McKinsey report, Women in the Workforce and Setting Expectations. But again, this was leaning into kind of the pay equity gaps, the challenges of climbing up to that C-suite level. And so, women are stuck in these management or administrative roles and they're just already at a disadvantage by default. So I think, now's the time for like leaders to be more intentional about ensuring that women have a voice and a seat at the table through making these vehicles for upskilling more accessible and more easy so that they can adapt and kind of set themselves up for an opportunity, to win and to have a level playing field. And so having inclusive AI systems is really important. We know that there just isn't enough women in the STEM sectors. And so there's a whole pipeline issue when we think of our education system, trying to get, of course, younger women and students to think about taking these STEM courses so that they can have a competitive advantage and getting more women in data science and these growing jobs that, of course, new technology is creating. So even though there's some jobs that we're worried about that are going to be replaced, there's a whole bunch of new jobs that are going to be created. And so I think women need to like kind of even position themselves for those opportunities. It will require your own investment. I've been someone who's tried to do that by looking at the intersection of tech and policy. And when I started 4 years ago, it wasn't popular. Nobody's really talking about AI governance as much as they are now. We know the ethics piece is still missing, but you can still think ahead and this is coming. So position yourself to be a solution. And that almost requires you to be more entrepreneurial because when you're someone who solves problems, you're setting yourself up to be a leader, to be at the decision table and to shape the direction, hopefully, that how we want AI to go.
I think all of that plus. So there's a couple of other pieces from my research. I have done women in the workplace for the last 5 years. I've been reading and it was part of my master's thesis and now part of my dissertation. So it's a very, very powerful research study that's done every year. Um, but I think that there's other spaces. So yes, in the corporate world, and if you think about um, women who are potentially being displaced from these admin roles, I think it's community based as well. AI actually has a fairly low barrier to entry. When you talked about typical tech before AI, when I graduated with my comp sci degree, back when I was 4 because I was a child prodigy, my resume looked at all of the different programming languages. That was my profile. That's what I submitted to companies. I could code this way, that way, that way, that way, that way. Um, Now with AI, it doesn't really matter how many programming languages I have, right? And you can get into AI without programming or very low barrier, right? Low code, no code ways to get into to AI and use it. And that sets up a huge opportunity for community-based programs to help with retraining and upskilling. Yes, you need the corporate spaces. I think the other thing that's very interesting in the lens of AI, and this is actually the core of my research study itself. There were some corollaries and some other papers that I wrote, but what's core to it is that in those studies, and it's tied to Deloitte's also Women at Work. So there's Women in the Workplace and Women at Work. One's by McKinsey, one's by Deloitte. 3 out of 10 senior executive women don't want to be in corporations anymore. They just don't feel that they have the support that they need. AI actually enables you to start your own company with fairly low barriers to entry. The last piece that I wanted to twist on this is, going back to that skills list, because again, I think everything starts at skills. If you have capability, you have potential. Pew Research has done multiple studies that show that women actually have much higher aptitude in those core human skills that are needed for success in AI: empathy, strategic thinking, design thinking, systems thinking, because typically women's worlds are one massive systems thinking. You manage your family, you manage your work, you manage transportation of your family. You are constantly managing multiple things, and it's all one system plus your job, right? Your day job, whatever your day job is. And so those spaces are very well occupied by women in terms of skill and capability. What we need to do is help women understand that those skills are absolutely core success skills in AI. And I think that again goes back to community-based work and how can we help give people opportunities either, in the US at the community college level or free community training or nonprofits that can do that kind of work.
Makes sense. Women actually often have got that empathy,
Absolutely.
and women, um, yes, a lot of women are sitting in those admin roles that are unfortunately at risk of automation. But I agree with you, we are going to see new types of roles. We now have got an AI ethicist role, we have got an
Mhm.
AI engineer, AI governance. That's a new function. And that is different from data governance. Is there even such a thing as ethical AI? Can we even regulate this technology? It's a huge topic of discussion. Can you actually have ethical and inclusive AI? And can you make sure in companies and just in general that you can have the right guardrails? So the question is, can you even get close to regulation? And I'm not talking at a big scale, but are we going to have governments coming up with something to make sure that we have some regulation of this?
Mhm. I'll probably start with this one. So governments are like playing in this sandbox of frameworks and suggestions. Like outside of the EU Act, which is like the first and very, strong EU legislation, we really need legislation with strong enforcement and accountability and fines attached to it, especially when we're thinking of sectors with highly sensitive information and serving vulnerable people. So of course, our public healthcare system, right? That needs to have really strong regulatory frameworks with enforcement. And so if there is no enforcement and there's no accountability, then corporations will feel like it's just a nice to have, but if they don't do it, they may see, they could end up, of course, in the court of law because they do have to follow existing laws that we have, right? We have our privacy legislation. We do have existing laws in terms of discrimination and things like that. And there has been lawsuits against companies and companies have been fined, but then those companies may see that as a cost of doing business, right? So they pay the fine and they continue. So the fine has to be really significant. They have to realize that I think if we try to get corporations, especially in the private sector, to understand there's a good business case, right? Like you can have good ROI because you want to have a good reputation. You don't want to be fighting these court battles because you were negligent in governance, right? There can be some cost savings because if you move too quickly without scaling in a way that's responsible, it will cost you more to just find the right system. So it's good to really take your time with precision in how you integrate AI so that you can, save costs. So you don't spend all this time, retraining staff again and making sure that you understand that having ethical practices will just make it just fair for your system. You can improve, workforce productivity and workforce culture because you're committing to principles that are pretty much shared common values. But I think there's this conditioning to innovate at all cost, and we have to increase our compute power. So people are just racing to have AI without spending enough time to think about how to get AI right or integrate it responsibly and ethically, and that there is a business case, to have diverse teams. There is a business case to like invest in women and equity deserving groups. And that just probably needs to be highlighted more so that companies, for profit or nonprofit governments can truly see the value in that.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's another piece of it. Before AI, companies started to realize that there was a mandate for inclusion and a mandate for ethics when they lost clients, right? Clients, if your company doesn't look like your client's not going to purchase from your company. As we scale, and Alina, you brought up regulated companies, right? If we're building agents and agents are going to take over a bank, they have no choice but to put the guardrails in, right? Because it's a highly regulated industry. I think one of the things that happened is AI started in places that were less regulated, right? So you kind of had this little bit of free for all. Now, as it continues to scale and scale across all industries, scale across medicine, scale across legal and finance and banking and those sectors, which are much more regulated and with greater penalty for violation, it is going to force companies to slow down because if you have to do it for one industry, it's a lot easier than to include that in your governance for other industries. So, from the large company perspective, I think that governance is going to come sooner and in greater scale. The real key is getting the message out to solopreneurs, to getting the message out to small companies about the importance of it. So I think, there's now the Responsible AI Alliance. There's several companies in the States that are building responsible AI documentation. I don't think we've gotten quite to the place of legislation yet, but there is guidelines and guardrails being created. I know in Canada the same, that there's the conversations are happening. So is there such a thing as ethical and responsible? Yes. Are we there? No. But I think this year's I believe, is going to be a pivot point for a lot of things. It's going to be a pivot point for governance and operating model within companies. And I think it's going to be a pivot point for governance in industries because we're just there. Companies are not going to be able to sell in certain industries unless they get there. And then I think the next circle of influence is getting to smaller companies, solopreneurs, single agents, single apps, those kinds of spaces.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our speakers. And before we wrap up, do you have any parting words to our audience? How do you make sure that you are succeeding with AI in 2026? Stacy or Victoria?
Certainly.
No, go ahead, Tracy, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, certainly. So, I mean, it's always important to take the time to invest in yourself. So, understanding, as Victoria actually mentioned earlier, those foundational principles of AI, how AI works, what is agentic AI, the different foundational principles of deep learning and machine learning. So do that investment in yourself as your own professional growth, because continuous learning is an important skill. And then understand that now's the time to lean into our soft skills, because as you know, AI systems are replacing those technical parts of a job and your workflow. Now's the time for you to have better empathy, better creativity, and really leaning into those soft skills so that you can master that and spend more time doing what's considered high valued work. And so that would be, my thoughts for everyone today. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yep. So I agree with all of that. I will say that Stanford University, MIT, and some of the large companies, Google Cloud, they've put AI training programs out for free. Plus, we have our AI Academy here at AI Future Leaders and Opportunities. I mean, there is spaces where you can take classes for free. It is not a financial investment. What it is a time investment. And I agree completely with Stacy, and invest in yourself, because that's the space, right? If you think about lifelong learning as a core skill, just take step one. I have said to many, many women's groups where we've talked about AI and people who are fearful of losing your job, this is not a brick wall barrier to entry. You don't have to knock down a brick wall. There's literally a door. You just have to turn the handle and walk through. And if you can walk through and take that first step, there are people to help you on the other side. So I encourage you to go ahead and take that first step, and then build your network. Build your LinkedIn is a great place to build a network. I have met women and colleagues all over the world who are very, very committed to upskilling and making AI more ethical and inclusive. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to our speakers. Do register to our next webinars. I shared the link in the chat. And I wish you all a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.